The congregation of Greater True Light Baptist Church had gathered to witness a divine union, a pastor and his bride, standing before God. The sanctuary was alive with joyous hymns, the air thick with the scent of flowers and the warmth of celebration. For Pastor Tyrese Jamarian Covington, this was meant to be the crowning moment of his ministry, a day when he would step into his future with the woman the world believed was his perfect match. But hidden beneath his pristine white tuxedo and the polished words of his vows was a past riddled with secrets, deception, and betrayal. Outside, as the choir's voices soared, another sound echoed in the distance, the slow, deliberate footsteps of a woman whose heart had been shattered beyond repair. A woman whose love had been discarded, whose cries for justice had been ignored. She had not come to bless this union. She had come to end it. What happens when a man of God preaches virtue while living a life of sin? When the foundation of his empire is built on lies, manipulation, and broken promises? The truth, no matter how deeply buried, always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, the reckoning is never gentle. Before we unravel the shocking events that turned a holy ceremony into a blood-stained nightmare, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more chilling tales of love, lies, and betrayal. 38-year-old Tyrese Jamarian Covington was the kind of pastor people revered, a man whose presence commanded attention the moment he stepped into a room. His sermons weren't just words, they were performances, delivered with a booming voice and the perfect cadence to stir souls. He spoke of righteousness, of faith, of the sacred bond of marriage, and the importance of integrity. To his congregation at Greater True Light Baptist Church, he was more than just a pastor. He was a spiritual guide, a role model, a man anointed by God to lead his people. But beneath the tailored suits, the carefully curated words, and the unwavering conviction in his voice, Tyrese was a man of contradictions. While he stood behind the pulpit preaching about sin, he was living a double life, indulging in the very temptations he condemned. He had spent years perfecting the art of deception, knowing exactly what to say, how to say it, and who to say it to in order to get what he wanted. And among those who fell under his spell was Milan Dejaé Roberson. Milan, 28, had been a devoted member of Greater True Light since she was a teenager. She had grown up in the church, soaking in every sermon, singing in the choir, and volunteering whenever she could. But life had not been kind to her. She had struggled, battled personal demons, and felt lost more times than she could count. It was in those dark moments that she turned to Tyrese, believing he was the man who could lead her back to the light. At first, their relationship was built on trust. Milan saw him as a mentor, a spiritual father figure, someone who genuinely cared about her well-being. He listened when no one else did. He prayed with her, guided her, reassured her that God had a plan for her life. But somewhere along the way, those counseling sessions turned into something else. The lines blurred. The prayers turned into lingering touches, the guidance became something far more intimate. Tyrese had a way of making Milan feel special, like she was the only woman in the world who truly understood him. He told her things he claimed he couldn't tell anyone else, how the pressures of leading a congregation weighed on him, how lonely it was to be a man of God with no one to confide in. He painted a picture of a man burdened by responsibility, desperate for someone to see him, to love him for who he really was. And Milan believed him. She believed him when he whispered that she was different from all the others. That their love was real, even if it had to remain in the shadows for now. He promised her a future, marriage, a home, a family. He told her to be patient, that one day, when the timing was right, they would be together in the open. And Milan, blinded by love and devotion, held on to those promises with all her heart. What she didn't know, what she couldn't see, was that Tyrese was a master of illusion. While he made her feel like she was his world, she was nothing more than another secret, another conquest, another name on a long list of women who had fallen for his charm. Tyrese Jamarian Covington had always known how to get what he wanted. He could mold himself into whatever image best suited his ambitions. To his congregation, he was the anointed man of God. To Milan, he was a lover and protector. But when he met Sanaya Rochelle at a church convention, everything changed. Sanaya, 29, wasn't just beautiful, she was powerful. She came from a family that commanded respect, a lineage of pastors, politicians, and business moguls. Her father was a well-connected bishop, her mother a philanthropist with deep ties to influential circles. To marry Sanaya wasn't just about love, it was about legacy. She represented status, stability, and financial security. She was the kind of woman who could elevate Tyrese from a respected pastor to a national religious figure. With her by his side, doors would open that he never could have imagined. And just like that, Milan became a distant memory. At first, she didn't notice the change. Tyrese had always been busy, his schedule packed with meetings, events, and counseling sessions. But then the excuses became more frequent. The phone calls went unanswered. The texts grew cold and mechanical. The man who had once whispered sweet promises in the dark now treated her like an afterthought. There were no more stolen moments, no more professions of love. He had disappeared from her life without a word, as if she had never mattered at all. Milan tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just overwhelmed. Maybe he needed space. But deep down, she felt something shift, a silent dread growing in the pit of her stomach. Then came the moment that shattered everything. One Sunday morning, she sat in the pews of Greater True Light, listening as the church secretary made the weekly announcements. And then she heard it, "Let us rejoice as we celebrate the upcoming nuptials of our beloved Pastor Tyrese Covington and Sister Sanaya Rochelle." Her body went numb. The world around her blurred, voices blending into a dull hum. She could hear the congregation erupt in applause, women gasping in excitement, men nodding in approval. But all she could focus on was the pounding of her heart, the sickening realization that the man she had given everything to had moved on without a second thought. He had never ended things with her. Never sat her down and told her the truth. Instead, he had left her in limbo, allowing her to believe in a future that had never existed. And now, he was parading his new fiancée in front of the entire church as if Milan had never been a part of his life. The betrayal was unbearable. But just when she thought the pain couldn't get any worse, another truth emerged, one that would change everything. Milan was pregnant. She stared at the test in disbelief, her hands trembling as she held it. A part of her had wanted to be wrong, to dismiss the nausea, the exhaustion, the changes in her body as something else. But there it was, undeniable proof that she was carrying Tyrese's child. A whirlwind of emotions crashed over her. Fear. Confusion. Hope. Maybe this was a sign. Maybe Tyrese would realize what he had done and come back to her. Maybe, despite everything, he would do the right thing. She gathered every ounce of courage and went to see him, determined to tell him the truth. But the man she faced that day was not the same one who had once held her in his arms. He was colder now, detached, his eyes filled with impatience rather than concern. And when she finally said the words, "I'm pregnant," he didn't react with shock, or joy, or even anger. He just sighed. A long, weary sigh, as if she were nothing more than a problem that needed to be handled. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask about the baby. Instead, he made himself very clear, he wanted nothing to do with it. He distanced himself even further, ignoring her calls, refusing to see her. And then, the final insult, he didn't even have the decency to speak to her himself. Instead, he sent 2 of his deacons to her apartment, men she had known for years, men who had once treated her like family. They handed her an envelope filled with cash, their expressions blank, their words rehearsed. "Pastor Covington wanted to make sure you were taken care of. This should help with any expenses." The humiliation was suffocating. He had reduced her to nothing more than an inconvenience, a loose end that needed to be tied up with money. All those nights he had held her, whispered his devotion, promised her forever, it had all been a lie. And now, he was offering her hush money to disappear from his life for good. But what Tyrese didn't realize was that Milan wasn't the same woman he had manipulated all those years. She had believed in his love, trusted in his promises, but now, she saw him for what he truly was. A fraud. A coward. A man who would do anything to protect his image, even if it meant abandoning the child they had created together. And while he continued planning his perfect wedding, basking in the glory of his congregation's adoration, Milan was left with nothing but rage. Love had turned to betrayal. Betrayal had turned to devastation. And devastation? That had turned into something else entirely. Something dangerous. Then came the wedding. The wedding was nothing short of perfection. The sanctuary of Greater True Light Baptist Church was bathed in golden light, the air thick with the scent of fresh lilies and the sound of jubilant hymns. Family, friends, and devoted church members filled every pew, their eyes gleaming with admiration as Pastor Tyrese Covington stood at the altar, dressed in an immaculate white suit, his bride Sanaya beside him, radiant in silk and lace. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the pinnacle of his carefully crafted life. He had the perfect woman, the perfect future, and the unwavering adoration of his congregation. His sins had been neatly buried, his past mistakes swept under the plush red carpet leading to the altar. Today was about new beginnings, about stepping into a future untouched by the ghosts of his past. But ghosts don't stay buried for long. The moment the church doors burst open, the joyous music came to a screeching halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. The choir fell silent. Every head turned toward the entrance, and the room seemed to shrink in an instant. And there she was. Milan Dejaé Roberson. 7 months pregnant. Eyes filled with fire and heartbreak. The moment their eyes met, a hush fell over the sanctuary. Tyrese's face drained of all color as he instinctively stepped back, clutching Sanaya's hand. Milan, a storm brewing for years, was finally about to break. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Church mothers clutched their pearls. Deacons exchanged uneasy glances. Sanaya, still dressed in the glow of blissful ignorance, furrowed her brows, confused by the sudden shift in energy. But Tyrese? He knew. He knew the moment he saw the trembling fury in Milan's hands, the weight of the Glock 19, gripped tight, her knuckles white. The air turned thick with tension, suffocating in its intensity. Milan stepped forward, her voice trembling yet filled with undeniable rage. "You lied to me." A single sentence, but it echoed like a war cry. "You promised me a life. You told me I was the only one. And now, here you are, standing in God's house, marrying another woman like I never existed." Sanaya's breath hitched as she turned to Tyrese, her hands trembling. What is she talking about? But Tyrese couldn't answer. He was frozen, paralyzed in the moment his lies came crashing down around him. Milan's eyes burned with unshed tears. "I gave you everything, Tyrese. My love, my trust, my body. And when I told you I was carrying your child, you threw me away like trash." She let out a bitter, broken laugh. "And now you want to stand here, in front of God, and pretend like none of it ever happened?" The murmurs turned into gasps. The congregation sat in stunned silence, watching the carefully constructed image of their beloved pastor unravel before them. Sanaya took a slow step back, realization dawning on her face. "Tell me it's not true," she whispered. "What is she talking about?" But Milan didn't wait for an answer. Her hands trembled as she lifted the gun, the weight of her betrayal fueling the rage coursing through her veins. "I begged you to do right by me," she whispered. "I begged you to take care of this baby. And what did you do? You blocked my number, ignored my calls, sent your little deacons to throw money at me like I was some common whore. And now, you stand up here, marrying this woman, pretending your hands are clean." Tyrese took a cautious step forward. "Milan, put the gun down, you don't want to do this." But it was too late. Milan let out a guttural scream and squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out. A deafening explosion of sound shattered the sanctuary's stillness. Tyrese jerked back, a red bloom spreading across his pristine white suit. He staggered, a choked gasp escaping his lips as he clutched his chest. Before anyone could react, a second shot followed. This time, it struck his abdomen, knocking the breath from his lungs as he crumpled to the ground. Screams erupted. Chaos consumed the church. Congregants dove behind pews, some praying, others crying, none believing what they had just witnessed. Sanaya's veil slipped from her head as she dropped to her knees beside Tyrese, her hands shaking as she tried to press against the bleeding wounds. "Somebody call 911, a voice shrieked. But Milan wasn't done. She took slow, measured steps forward, towering over Tyrese as he gasped for breath, the man who had once whispered sweet nothings in the dark, the man who had promised her the world only to leave her in ruins. "You could have done right by me," she whispered, tears streaking down her face. "But you left me to suffer." With that, a final shot rang out, a clean, point-blank bullet to the head. Tyrese Covington's reign ended right there, at the altar where he had planned to start his new life. His blood pooled beneath him, soaking into the sacred ground of the church where he had once preached about righteousness. Screams filled the sanctuary, echoing off the high ceilings as the reality of what had just happened settled over the congregation like a suffocating fog. Some fell to their knees, sobbing and praying, as if divine intervention could turn back time. Others scrambled toward the exits, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before them. The once holy house of worship had transformed into a scene of horror, one that would never be forgotten. Sanaya remained frozen, her wedding dress stained with Tyrese's blood, her mind struggling to process the violence that had shattered her perfect day. Moments ago, she was a bride standing at the altar, ready to vow forever. Now, her future was buried beneath the weight of betrayal, deceit, and death. But the nightmare wasn't over. Milan stood over Tyrese's lifeless form, her breath ragged, her body trembling. The gun felt heavier in her hands now, as if it carried the weight of everything she had lost, her dignity, her love, her future. Her gaze lifted, settling on Sanaya, the woman who had unknowingly taken everything from her. Rage reignited in her chest. Sanaya gasped as Milan raised the Glock again, her finger tightening around the trigger. The world seemed to slow. "You don't get to have the life I was promised." The shot rang out. The bullet tore through Sanaya's arm, sending her crashing to the ground with a sharp cry of pain. Blood trickled down her sleeve, staining the delicate lace of her wedding gown. She clutched her arm, eyes wide with shock, her breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The pain was excruciating, but unconsciousness took her before she could fully register what had happened. Milan stared at her, chest rising and falling with unsteady breaths. But something inside her shifted. The rage that had driven her to this moment, the fury, the heartbreak, the desperation, was beginning to fade. The sirens were getting closer. The wailing of police cars grew deafening, filling the air with a terrifying finality. Red and blue lights flashed through the stained glass windows, casting eerie colors across the carnage inside. Milan's grip loosened. The gun slipped from her fingers, clattering to the ground. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the blood-stained floor, her body trembling, her mind numb. The church doors burst open. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn, voices shouting commands. "Put your hands where we can see them. Get on the ground." But Milan didn't resist. She lifted her hands slowly, her energy drained, her spirit broken. Cold steel cuffs snapped around her wrists, locking her fate into place. As they pulled her to her feet, she didn't fight. She didn't cry. She simply closed her eyes. Behind her, the congregation wept. Sanaya sobbed in pain. And Tyrese Covington, the man who once stood as a pillar of faith, lay motionless, his blood marking the end of his deception. Milan had come for justice. Now, all she had left was the consequences. The courtroom buzzed with tension, packed wall to wall with reporters, church members, and onlookers eager to witness the trial of Milan Dejaé Roberson. The once devoted parishioner, now a convicted killer, sat motionless at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. The weight of her crime loomed over the proceedings like a dark cloud, but the battle for justice, or mercy, had only just begun. Milan's defense team wasted no time shaping their argument. They painted her not as a cold-blooded murderer but as a broken woman, manipulated and discarded by a man who had wielded his spiritual authority like a weapon. They spoke of her youth, her vulnerability, and the false promises that had bound her to a man who preached righteousness but lived in sin. Tyrese Covington was not the man he claimed to be, her attorney declared, pacing before the jury. He took advantage of Milan in the name of counseling. He groomed her, used her, and when she became inconvenient, he threw her away. The defense leaned into the details, how Tyrese had promised marriage, how he had sworn she was his one true love, how he had turned his back on her the moment he found someone with money, power, and influence. They described her pregnancy not as a joyous occasion but as a cruel burden, one she had been forced to carry alone while the father of her child celebrated his new life with another woman. But the prosecution wasn't interested in heartbreak. They saw something far more dangerous in Milan: cold, calculated vengeance. The lead prosecutor stood before the jury, his voice firm, unwavering. This was not a crime of passion. This was an execution. He laid out the facts. Milan had walked into that church armed with a loaded Glock 19. She hadn't been invited, hadn't been provoked. This was not a crime of passion. She had come with AP. This was an execution. He laid out the facts. Milan had walked into that church armed with a loaded Glock 19. She hadn't been invited, hadn't been provoked. She had come with a purpose. He painted a stark picture of Milan as a woman scorned, unable to accept the reality that Tyrese had moved on. He emphasized her lack of remorse, how she had stood over his body, how she had pulled the trigger over and over again, how she had only surrendered when the sirens closed in. The jury listened intently, their faces impassive as both sides waged war over Milan's fate. Days stretched into weeks as testimony after testimony unfolded, church members who had idolized Tyrese, friends who had witnessed Milan's downward spiral, psychologists who debated whether her actions were born of trauma or pure rage. And then, finally, the moment of truth arrived. Milan sat still as the jury filed back in, her face eerily calm as the foreman stood to deliver the verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Milan Dejaé Roberson, guilty of first-degree murder. A sharp gasp rippled through the courtroom. The judge wasted no time. Milan Dejaé Roberson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. As the bailiff led her away, she cast one final glance toward the gallery, where Sanaya sat with her arm in a sling, her once bright future dimmed by the tragedy that unfolded at the altar. This wasn't the ending Milan had dreamed of. But it was the one she had chosen. Greater True Light Baptist Church was never the same. Once a thriving congregation that hung on Pastor Tyrese Jamarian Covington's every word, it had become a ghost of its former self. His murder had done more than just end a life, it had shattered the foundation of faith for those who had trusted him. As his double life came to light, so did the whispers of doubt. How had they not seen the signs? How had they followed a man who preached virtue while indulging in sin? Attendance plummeted, donations dried up, and within months, the church that Tyrese built was nothing more than an empty shell. Sanaya Rochelle was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer made sense. She had come to that church expecting a future filled with love and stability, only to be left humiliated before God and man. The weight of the scandal was unbearable. She couldn't escape the headlines, the judgmental stares, or the shame that followed her every step. So, she did the only thing she could, she left. Disappearing from the public eye, Sanaya erased herself from the world that had once celebrated her. No one knew where she went, and no one dared to ask. And then, there was Milan. Inside a cold prison cell, she brought a child into the world, a son who would never know the man she had loved, the man she had killed. As she cradled him in her arms, she wasn't thinking about vengeance or betrayal. Only regret. There was no undoing what had been done. No rewinding time. All she could do now was live with the consequences of a love story that had turned into a tragedy. This tragic story serves as a haunting reminder of how deception, power, and betrayal can spiral into devastating consequences. Tyrese Jamarian Covington stood at the pulpit, preaching righteousness while living in sin. He built his legacy on lies, manipulating those who trusted him the most. And in the end, those very lies cost him his life. But was Milan truly a cold-blooded murderer, or was she a victim of manipulation, discarded and pushed beyond her breaking point? Could her rage have been prevented if Tyrese had simply told the truth from the start? Or was this tragedy inevitable the moment he chose deception over honesty? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story shocked you, don't forget to like this video and subscribe where we uncover the darkest intersections of love, lies, and betrayal.